Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I am Rayla Puno, and I am a research associate at the NUS Center for International Law. Today, we are fortunate to hear from five distinguished speakers, after which we will have a roundtable discussion where there will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions from all our speakers through the chat box. I will now hand it over to Daniel Yao and Dr. Petra Minerope for the welcome remarks. Daniel is an adjunct senior research fellow and leads the Climate Change Law and Policy Program at the NUS Center for International Law. Dr. Minerope is the academic lead of Durham University for UNFCCC engagement and the founder and current director of the Durham Center for Sustainable Development Law and Policy, as well as co-director of the Global Policy Institute.
Thank you, Ryla. And first, on behalf of the NUS Center for International Law, on behalf of the director, Dr. Nilofer Oral, who's online with us today, let me first warmly welcome our panel of very distinguished speakers and also all the various online participants to the first of our two-part Global Stocktake 2022/2023 series. We are particularly delighted to partner with Durham University Center for Sustainable Development Law and Policy under the Law School in this initiative. And particular thanks to Professor Petra Minerope for her energy and her enthusiasm in this project. I would also like to express our deep appreciation and thanks to the UNFCCC Secretariat for their support and their participation in this series, really despite what is no doubt an extremely busy and hectic pre-COP season. So why this workshop series, you may ask? Well, despite the climate crisis impacting countries across the world with increasing frequency and force, global greenhouse gas emissions are at an all-time high, rebounding from the pandemic dip and surpassing the pre-pandemic peak. The first global stocktake of the Paris Agreement set for 2023 is therefore critical in determining where we are, where do we want to be, and more importantly, how do we even get there? Today's workshop will focus on oceans and climate change. The ocean has the potential to contribute greatly to adaptation and mitigation efforts that will allow us to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And yet, the development of international law on oceans and climate change seems to be somewhat fallen behind. This workshop will examine the recent international policy developments on ocean and climate change and the expectations for the upcoming discussions in international law. It will also examine opportunities in which ocean issues can play a larger role in the global stocktake and how governments can fully integrate these issues into the NDCs. So finally, I'd like again to thank our speakers for joining us, sharing their expertise on the various topics that we'll be discussing. I look forward to very stimulating and robust discussions. Let me now pass the floor over to Dr. Petra Minerope from Durham University for her welcome remarks and also to share perhaps more on the second part of this workshop that will take place this Friday. Over to you, Petra.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and good afternoon to Singapore. Good morning when you are more closely to the UK. It's a great honor for me to be here and to partner again with colleagues from the Center of International Law at the National University of Singapore, with Nilofer, Danielle, Raya, and Gary as well. And I thank you so much for the organization of this first workshop. And as Danielle already said, this is a series of two workshops, and we are delighted to have the support of the UNFCCC Secretariat for both of these workshops. And I'm also very privileged that I was allowed to come into this existing collaboration between CIL and the UNFCCC Secretariat. And I know that this builds on a previous very successful workshop series already. Now, in the second workshop on Friday, I hope we can explore the more perhaps general questions on how the outcomes and outputs of the global stocktake can inform the ambition in the next round of NDCs. How do we use this in a legal and in a political way? And I hope that we can learn, especially from colleagues from the Secretariat who are dealing with these issues on a daily basis, how we can ask the right questions in our research so that we can produce something that is meaningful for this process as we are going forward. And without further ado, I give this back now to the organizers. Thank you again very much for allowing me to be here as well.
Thank you, Daniel and Petra. With that, I will move on to welcoming our first speaker. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Nilofer Oral, Director at the NUS Center for International Law. Dr. Oral has over 20 years of experience in the study, teaching, and practice of international law. In 2016, she was elected by the UN General Assembly to the International Law Commission, where she's co-chair of the study group on sea level rise in relation to international law. Today, Dr. Oral will focus on tracing where the oceans are in the UNFCCC process and why there's a need to streamline it, especially into the global stocktake.
Thank you, Rayla, and thank you so much, Danielle. And may I say, dear Petra, it is always a great joy and privilege to work with you and collaborate with you. So I have to say that I'm also eternally grateful for your continued support of working with the Center for International Law. And also I value very much this relationship with the UNFCCC Secretariat. And I hope that this series will continue. And of course, I have to thank the team at CIL for their incredibly valuable support. So I am going to, let me just, and of course, the speakers who are with us today, if I may, and all of you who are joining us. All right, let me get my PowerPoint up. You can see it. Yes? All right.
Yes, we can.
All right. So I think today I am going to do a little bit more of just setting the scene a little bit, because I know subsequent speakers are going to focus much more on the detail of the ocean and the UNFCCC, and as we head towards a global stocktake. So my heading is actually finding the ocean in the UNFCCC process towards a global stocktake. And I think touching upon something that Danielle said, the ocean really has been missing from the 30 years. We celebrated the 30th anniversary this year of the UNFCCC convention and the process. And yet we know that the ocean is absolutely critical for climate change. The ocean is 70% of Earth's surface, but certainly not 70% of the UNFCCC process. We owe the climate we have to the ocean. And if you follow, you know there's this incredible global ocean conveyor belt. It takes about 1,000 years to make a full rotation around the world, but it takes the warm water from the south through this complicated process of currents to the north. So Petra, those of you in the UK have a mild climate because of this, but we know it is being impacted by climate change. The ocean holds 50 times more carbon dioxide than the atmosphere does. And it has absorbed more than 25%, that is a quarter, of anthropogenic human activity resulting carbon dioxide. And the ocean has really protected us from what would have been much more severe impacts of climate change, because it has absorbed 90% of the atmospheric warming that has occurred due to, again, human activities and increasing greenhouse gases. And of course, it's an important reflective force shielding us against solar radiation. In sum, absolutely critical, the ocean. Yet, well, I'll get to the yet part. So here I've done a summary, but I have another slide where I go into much more detail, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to do that. Beginning in 1990, with the first assessment report of the IPCC, until the most recent one, the sixth assessment report, including special reports on warming at 1.5 degrees centigrade, and also the first special report on the ocean and cryosphere and a changing climate. Each one of these has highlighted the negative, the adverse impacts of climate change on the ocean. It was only in 2007, the fourth assessment report, that there was a first reference to ocean acidification, because really it had only been newly, I don't want to say discovered, but assessed by scientists. What I want to just highlight here is the ocean and climate change has been on the radar of the scientists for a long time. And what we've seen over time is that the ocean in 1990 was warming, and that warming has accelerated. Each one of these reports tells us that. In 1990, there was sea level rise, and guess what? It's accelerating as well. And probably each scientific report ends up being more conservative than the previous. Now we know that the global average of sea level rise by the end of the century on the high emission scenario, which is frankly the one we're on right now, is 1.1 meters. But we know that certain regions, such as Southeast Asia, the Pacific, East Coast of the United States, will experience higher levels of sea rise. And lastly, something that has popped up on the agenda more recently, but equally very, very significant risk to marine life, is ocean acidification. We know that the ocean warming is having very deleterious impacts on coral reefs. There's been studies on those, and the reality is that if we keep on this trajectory, our coral reefs are not going to survive. Ocean warming is also having very significant impacts on marine fisheries. And remember, fisheries are the livelihood of millions of people, a billions of dollar industry. And we know that because of ocean warming, one thing that's happening is that there's fish migration. The fish are moving poleward. And we know that's already creating disputes, the Northeast Atlantic mackerel dispute. So all of these, the problems are there. I'm giving a very, very abbreviated version. I have much more detailed slides. And last but not least is ocean acidification. It's called the twin evil sister of climate change, but nonetheless, it is a result of the ocean having absorbed over 25% of carbon dioxide. It has changed the alkaline level, the pH level of the ocean. And what does this mean? Very simply, it means that oysters, lobsters, all the shellfish, crustaceans, they are not able to form the necessary shells and skeletal. And this is already having an impact on shellfish industry. This is not a future projection, it is happening right now. And the level of change in pH balance is not been seen in the last 2 million years. So just to give you an idea of the scale of this problem. But where is the ocean in the UNFCCC? Well, there's just one mention of it in the convention itself under Article 4, paragraph 1D. And that is what I call a functional role that the ocean is seen as. It's a sink or reservoir, basically to absorb and store carbon dioxide. That's it. The Paris Agreement, again, after all the scientific reports out there, there's one reference to in the preamble, the ocean, and I'm happy to say I contributed to that. And then an indirect reference to Article 4 of the UNFCCC, the convention, in Article 5. So that's it. So we're heading now to the global stocktake. And the question is, to what extent will the ocean be reflected? And I know that Joanna after me is going to be talking much more detail about what has happened basically in the last few years to bring the ocean into the process. And how much will the ocean actually be part of the global stocktake? I think that to me is very important. And here's this, to me, this is the diagram of what the global stocktake, how it's structured, which I find a little frightening. But again, I guess my question is, where's the ocean here? Where will it fit in? And I think this is a very important question, and I hope that today in this round in our discussions, we'll be able to look at that more. And so basically, that's my presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to the other speakers and then the discussion that follows. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nilofer, for that insightful presentation that really underscores the importance of the issues that we are discussing today. So our next speaker is Dr. Joanna Post. Dr. Post is Program Management Officer at the Secretariat of the UNFCCC. She leads negotiations and international support on the research and systematic observation agenda under the SUBSTA, and also leads support for ocean-related activities and engagement, including as the Secretariat's UN Oceans focal point. Dr. Post will discuss the importance of protecting the ocean and its ecosystems and the efforts of the COP and the UNFCCC Secretariat in strengthening ocean-based climate action.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Let me just share my slides with you. Are you able to see that, Ryla? Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. A very good day to you all, whichever time zone you may be in. So I wanted to follow on very nicely from Dr. Oral's presentation and talk a little bit more in detail about the process under the UNFCCC and how the ocean is integrated or integrating as we move forward, and how important this is both for national level action and for the global stocktake, as well as for the ocean itself, in fact. I will mention briefly and reflect back. This is very much a sort of mirror of what Dr. Oral was saying, but I think what's important to remember is Article 1.3 of the Convention, wherein the climate system, so the Convention refers to the protection of the climate system, but it defines the climate system as the totality of the atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and geosphere, and the interactions. And I think oftentimes it's forgotten in conversations that how important this definition is of our climate system. The ocean, we live on a blue marble, we don't live on a green one or a brown one. And I think there's a real disconnect in many people's minds, even of how connected we all are to the ocean. As often it's far away, or it's not certainly mentioned in political conversations. So I think we're getting there, but it's been a work in progress. I won't go into the detail. Dr. Oral also mentioned, of course, the ocean is mentioned in the UNFCCC Convention. It's also mentioned in the Paris Agreement. We also know it's the driver of the climate system. It's also being very much impacted by climate change. It's not just there as a sort of observer of what's happening. It is actually ocean warming is a big problem. Glacier melt is a big problem. It's both of those combined are causing sea level rise, which is, as we know from the IPCC, is now irreversible. At least 1 meter is expected by the end of the century. And then, of course, it's causing much stronger extreme events across the globe. And a lot of people around the world have been impacted by recent typhoons and flooding and so on. So the ocean is really being impacted by climate change. And I just wanted to reflect a little bit on how important science is in our process. We would not be here without science, without the observations, without the research, without the IPCC assessment, which has been referred to already today, that provides the information needed, not just for the policy process itself, for the UNFCCC process, but also for the decision making. And if you like, under the UNFCCC, there's these two sides to the conversation. Often there's mandates for parties to actually act on climate change, of course, but there's also mandates to the process itself, how to move the conversation forward, if you like, at the sessions that we have. And I would like to also mention, of course, that climate services have become a very much recognized part of the scientific value chain that really provides the information needed for decision making. There was a paradigm shift when the Paris Agreement happened. Up until that point, scientists were simply trying to get the message across about the importance of climate change and acting on everything the science was saying. Once the policy was recognized, the policymakers recognized the importance of the science and the need to do something with the Paris Agreement. So now this paradigm shift really needs to bring these conversations much more together to have a multidisciplinary conversation about providing solutions to the problem, so that we do meet 1.5, so that we do adapt to climate change, so that we do provide the resilience needed. this is a very very simplified diagram of the Paris Agreement, but I wanted to try and explain it to you because I think, as I've said often with conversations, the ocean is hidden in plain sight across the Convention and the Paris Agreement because of its huge role in driving the climate, because of the way it's being impacted by climate change, and because of the opportunities that it provides for action on climate change. The Paris Agreement in Article 2, parties have legally agreed to limit temperature well below 2 degrees, to adapt and foster resilience and low GHG development, and to build finance flows consistent with this path to low GHG emissions. And we all know of the 20 billion finance pledge by developed countries. So the Paris Agreement, if you like, on the top left of the screen, parties set their nationally determined contributions, their national targets. The Paris Agreement officially started in 2020, so the nationally determined contributions identify how parties are going to respond to climate change. They, of course, then need to act in terms of mitigation, adaptations, means of implementation and support, which is short for finance, capacity building and technology transfer. Parties will then report on their action through what's known under the Paris Agreement as the Enhanced Transparency Framework. There is a global stocktake at Article 14 of the Paris Agreement, which takes place every 5 years, and it currently is taking place right now. It's a 2-year process, if you like, that takes place every 5 years. But the intention of the global stocktake is to push for higher national ambition in the next round of NDCs. So it's a 5-year cyclical process, and I would strongly emphasize that the ocean is an important part of all of this. We know the science is telling us how much the ocean is being impacted. The GCOS identify and which are recognized by the UNFCCC process, the climate indicators, which include ocean. 4 of 7 of them are ocean-based indicators. The science is being developed. There's still a need to do more to understand better the water, the energy, the carbon cycles driven by the ocean. But we know enough, current science is mature for identifying the problems, even though we need to strengthen the observation science for offering solutions, and a lot of the observation gaps globally are actually ocean-based. But I think I would emphasize that we know enough to act and to recognize that the ocean is an important place where action can happen. Many of you may have heard of the high-level panel on sustainable ocean economy. They provided a report a couple of years ago looking at the ocean as a solution to climate change, and they actually found that approximately 20% of emission reductions could take place as ocean-based mitigation action, which includes emission reduction in shipping, blue carbon and carbon capture in ecosystems, renewable energy was a very strong part of that, and others. So there's solutions in the ocean for emissions reduction. Then there's also, of course, a need to protect ecosystems, to build resilience around coastal low-lying areas against increasing impacts from climate change. But under the Paris Agreement, also parties have to identify indicators to measure action. For mitigation, that's slightly easier because, of course, that's GHGs and measuring GHG emission reductions. For adaptation, it's a lot more complicated. So there's still a little bit of work to be done on not just adaptation and ocean-based adaptation, but also identifying indicators that to measure progress over time that ultimately can be aggregated at the global level for the global stocktake. So we had a long dry period of not mentioning the ocean very much in the political process under the UNFCCC. This changed with the Blue COP, which was originally due to take place in Chile and ended up in Madrid in 2019. Those were the days none of us knew what COVID was. And there was a mandate coming out of the Blue COP to have an ocean and climate change dialogue to consider how to strengthen adaptation mitigation action on ocean. And that dialogue took place a year later. It was due to take place 6 months later, but due to COVID, it was delayed. It took place virtually at the end of 2020, and there were some very clear messages coming out of that first dialogue. The need to strengthen understanding and inclusion of the ocean under the UNFCCC, under the process itself, to link the work very much across the UN. There's a lot of organizations across the UN working on oceans. We are a member of UN Oceans ourselves, so it's really important to link this work together so that there can be support at national level. National level recognition of the linkage between ocean and climate action is extremely important, and is an ongoing message, if you like. The need to look at finance can be used to strengthen ocean-based action. It's a different process and different opportunities there compared to land-based adaptation and land-based mitigation. And of course, a very strong message is this need to dialogue, as we're doing today, to exchange ideas, to exchange lessons learned, to look at how people are building on this action across the globe. So a clear message going into COP26 last year was the constant message that we have to protect the ocean, which means urgent emission reductions, but that the ocean is a place for action in terms of mitigation, in terms of adaptation and conservation and restoration of nature, to build sustainable development. The commitment to a finance went into COP26 last year and is being urged also to parties this year. The stronger inclusion of ocean action to the UNFCCC process was really the main message that was taken up at COP26, as well as the importance of science as a foundation. So coming into COP26, we had these clear messages from the first Ocean Climate Dialogue, and that came to the overarching decision, if you like, the Glasgow Climate Pact. As the COP presidency announced, they re-emphasized all of these messages around the ocean and the need to repair our relationship with the natural world. And the natural world, of course, a lot of that is in the ocean. A quarter of biodiversity globally sits in coral reefs. So we know what damage would happen if they disappeared. And the Glasgow Climate Pact, I won't go into all the detail on this table, but I think the important thing coming out of Glasgow was this mandate to the process, to all relevant work programs and the constituted bodies, these bodies under our process that look at individual work plans, such as capacity building, such as adaptation, such as loss and damage, and to ask all of these people to look at how to strengthen ocean-based action. But another very important part of this mandate was to hold an annual dialogue. So this mandate for a dialogue, which was a one-off that came out of the COP25, has now become an annual dialogue, which is extremely important moving forward to bring people together to discuss the ocean and climate and how to strengthen that action moving forward. And the first of those annual dialogues took place in June this year. And as our substitute chair mentioned at the time, it's the start of a new mandate, a new opportunity for really trying to pull together this strengthening of ocean and climate action, this advocacy for the need for it, and of course the discussion of how to act and strengthen action on it. I won't go into too much detail of the dialogue. I urge you to have a look at the web page itself. And we had an illustrator there who really pulled together some of the key messages, as you can see from this slide, which was one of 4 graphic slides that she produced from the dialogue. And you can see the summary, which is really, the ocean requires our urgent action, but there's also a space for solutions: decarbonizing shipping, climate smart fisheries and aquaculture, the need for protecting and restoring ecosystems, the need to scale up marine renewable. We know there's a finance gap that needs to be addressed. The Ocean Envoy, Peter Thompson, pushes very much this conversation whenever he meets with people. The importance of science, the importance of ocean becoming the heart of climate policies. So it's not just ocean policies nationally, it's ocean and climate needs to be brought together at the national level. That can be done through nationally determined contributions. It can certainly be done through national adaptation plans as well. And to integrate ocean as the part of all of the conversations under the UNFCCC. We took these messages to the UN Ocean Conference this year as well, which was really pushing, and you can see coming out of the Lisbon Declaration, a very strong message to bring these two topics together, that ocean and climate really should be in the same conversations. And we will, of course, take those messages to COP, but just wanted to say that 10 messages coming out of this year's dialogue was really the need to protect the ocean from climate change, but also value its place for climate solutions in action, to look at these ocean-based measures I've just measured, to look at the space there for integrated solutions. Marine technology and marine and coastal nature-based solutions should be integrated. So it's a very much a holistic viewpoint that is needed moving forward around solutions for ocean-based climate action. The science I've mentioned is the basis for everything we do. There's an important thing to mention is that the whole of society approach. There's a lot of work going on now to consider the ocean and its rights, to consider how to, you know, at the international level, we talk about adaptation and mitigation, means of implementation. These things all need to be integrated together at the national level. Funding I've mentioned, and the need for looking at novel opportunities, not just increasing finance, but looking at how to embrace the complexity in this area. And there's a lot of private public partnerships need to be pushed forward, and there is already some examples of that. Again, we work closely with our UN partners, and this is really there should be an opportunity for this framework for collaborative efforts moving forward beyond the mandates that UN Oceans has. And I think one of the things from the dialogue was this opportunity moving forward now in this space to really deep dive into some of the topics that help look at sort of distinctive actions that really can push this conversation forward. So I want to come back to this this diagram and come to really to this bottom part, the global stocktake. So all of the action I've mentioned is an urge really moving forward that NDCs need to contain ocean-based actions. Some do, some don't. There's an analysis coming out very soon from the World Resources Institute at COP to look at which NDCs contain ocean-based action. And our strong message to the UN Ocean Conference coming out of the summer dialogue was to blue the Paris Agreement. Of course, that action needs to happen, but the global stocktake itself is there to assess or aggregated action and collective progress moving forward. So of course it needs to mention the ocean and the ocean-based action, and this would be helped, of course, if the ocean came into NDCs and came into the enhanced transparency framework. But there's opportunities to build that into the conversations during the technical assessment anyway. So if colleagues want to take a look at the Global Stocktake webpage, the Global Stocktake, in brief, has three components to it: the information collection component, the technical assessment component, and the high-level component. So the information collection started at COP26, when the Global Stocktake started, and that's running until early next year. And at any time, people can submit information on the Global Stocktake. The technical assessment is running now, and as part of that work, it has a series of 3 technical dialogues. The first took place in June, the second will take place at COP, and the next one next year. And then the third component is a high-level component, which will really push the messages needed to increase higher national ambition next year. Now, the governance of the GST lies in the hands of the subsidiary body chairs, and they are tasked by the mandate for the global stocktake to identify guiding questions for each component. And I would say that the guiding questions for the technical assessment component, that one that's happening right now, does have reference to mitigation, to adaptation, to MOI, but also cross-cutting questions, which include questions about the ocean, about collaboration, working together. So that's also something to consider if colleagues wish to provide submissions to that, but it should also be considered in the conversations around the technical dialogue, because those are the questions provided by the subsidiary bodies. So I will, I know that Lisa, talking after me, will go into more detail about the opportunities for the global Stocktake. So I think what I would like to end with is really the messages coming out of this work, coming out of the dialogue, coming out of the UN Ocean Conference, really for Sharm el-Sheikh this year. So following the progress, we had a very process-orientated mandate, a very exciting one coming out of Glasgow last year, which really anchored oceans into the UNFCCC process. The push now, of course, in the implementation of the Paris Agreement is for greater national ambitions supported by finance and strengthened implementation at the national level. An important part of this is, of course, national ocean-based action and support. So the message really is to blue the Paris Agreement, to remember that ocean action is climate action and ocean finance is climate finance. And with that, I'd like to pass the floor back to Ryla, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Joanna. That was so interesting, and it is always helpful to learn about the various efforts that the UNFCCC is currently doing with regard to oceans and climate change, and also put it into context, the work that remains to be done. Up next, we have Lisa Schindler-Murray. She's a Senior Manager for Policy and Partnerships at RARE. She represents RARE across its international policy initiatives on biodiversity, climate change, and ocean policy. She's a co-author, along with Victoria Romero and Dorothy Hare of the IUCN, of Unpacking the UNFCCC Global Stocktake for Ocean Climate Action, a paper that seeks to provide a broader understanding of the interlinkages between the ocean and coastal and marine nature-based solutions as part of the Global Stocktake, or the GST. So Lisa will discuss the findings from this report and will briefly discuss the entry points to inform the GST and discuss the potential engagement opportunities to support ocean action in the GST for governments and other non-party stakeholders.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and give me 1 second while I share my screen. Let me try one more time. Sorry about the delay here. I'm trying to make this bigger. Can you see my screen here?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I'm very excited about the discussion that will be underway, and also very happy to have had the opportunity to go after the first two presenters to be able to talk a little bit more about some of the engagement opportunities for the global stocktake. And let's, I guess I'll start by sharing, actually, sorry, my screen is just doing a little something here. Sorry about that. So as we know and have heard and are all here today because of the global stocktake is a process to assess where we are regarding implementation and how to raise the ambition, the global ambition around climate change. And as Joanna shared, we are currently in the heart of the global stocktake process now, with the information collection and assessment period and the relevant technical dialogues underway. And so I'll build off of the presentations that we just heard about, along with some examples of the types of engagement options for governments and other stakeholders, including NGOs or academia, as a way to inform and support a successful outcome of the global stocktake that's inclusive of the ocean. So last year, as we heard in the introduction, RARE and IUCN, together with other partners, published a report analyzing the phases of the global stocktake. and what it means for the ocean to encourage parties and non-party stakeholders to all be aware of the different phases and input options for the global stocktake. As we saw from the first two presentations, it can be quite complicated. And so we wanted to make it as easy as possible to unpack what the type of engagement options could be to better reflect and act and encourage each other to increase climate ambition and action by assessing what's happened to date with the NDCs and other inputs. And so as a quick recap, we see the global stocktake as both forward-looking and somewhat backward-looking to both be able to meet the understand what's needed to meet the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement and to inform future action in NDCs, as well as to explore what's where we currently are to assess what the short-term actions are that were already presented in the NDCs. The global stocktake is not set up by thematic areas as we just heard, but rather by adaptation, mitigation, and finance, or the means of implementation, with cross-cutting themes like loss and damage and equity. So the global stocktake and the ocean and its coastal nature-based solutions in particular is relevant to all of the current global stocktake tracks. And this is an important opportunity to demonstrate the importance of ocean action for climate action by ensuring that the relevant ocean actions are incorporated into these inputs in a clear, concise, and common way across the different inputs from both parties and non-parties. And so what we heard from Joanna earlier was about the input submission process, which allows parties and non-parties alike to submit different types of inputs to the global stocktake, which are all included in and wrapped up into what the technical assessments will inform, and the final global stocktake or the first global stocktake in 2023 and every 5 years after that, as the ambition cycle demonstrated. And so what you see here on the slide is an example from the paper, which has a list of all of the non-exhaustive sources of inputs. And this is just a sampling, but it's a useful reflection for how the ocean and marine and coastal nature-based solutions can be well integrated in each of the existing areas. And so while you might notice that some of these inputs are not ocean specific, there is adequate flexibility here to be inclusive of ocean reports and ocean elements. And it will be important to ensure that there's a common message and takeaways that are clearly included in these dispersed inputs to enable the Secretariat and the reviewers to pull out the relevant themes, solidifying the ocean as a core component of the global stocktake. And we're starting to see this in the technical dialogues, where some of the core themes are already emerging, such as the role of nature or nature-based solutions. And so one of the takeaways that we intended from the paper was to demonstrate just how many types of options national governments and other stakeholders have with regards to the types of inputs that could include the ocean and coastal areas. And so, of course, the NDC is the clearest example that's directly linked to the Paris Agreement. But we also know that it's not inclusive of all of the activities or priorities in a country. There are national reports around biodiversity or sustainable development or housing development plans. And these are all can be climate relevant. And that might be integrated in other forms, whether that's the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, or the SDGs, or even disaster risk reduction. So, for example, a country could submit its NBSAP, or its National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, or even a report to the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands as an input to the global stocktake. But before I continue with this, I think one thing that we've learned from the first technical dialogue is that we have a lot of information coming in. And so one of the challenges is how to synthesize or analyze these relevant data sources in a meaningful way that will inform climate action and ambitions. It's both a challenge around having common indicators as well as a compilation challenge. And so I think that it's important an important point for us to consider, because while we want to ensure that all relevant national reports are part of this global assessment, we also want to be aware about what attachments might be necessary to ease the burden of assessing it all to ensure that it's as relevant and informative as possible. So I'll build off of this slide to provide a few examples of national reports that could inform the global stocktake. And I'll start with the adaptation track. So going back to the NBSAP example, the report could include a country's priority to protect its coastal and marine ecosystems and the relevant commitments associated with coastal conservation or restoration or sustainable management. And including, in some cases, how marine protected areas or other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, are contributing to achieving the biodiversity targets, or even 30 by 30 targets, as well as the climate co-benefits. So practically speaking, one may want to pull out those relevant pieces of these reports from this to ensure that there's clarity in the submission. And this could take the form of an attached summary outlining the key points relevant for climate mitigation, adaptation, or means of implementation and support within the report. But of course, attached to the full report for comprehensiveness. Beyond the direct submission of the report itself, other actions stakeholders could take to inform, let's say, the adaptation communication or the NBSAP in this example, would be to implement at the local level projects whose objectives it is to improve climate and community resilience, like ecosystem-based adaptation in sustainable fisheries or small-scale fisher communities. Or another example is to promote nature-based solution indicators for conservation and development plans. And this is critical for both a local level as well as a national level. And we heard a little bit about the importance of indicators at the national and the global level from Joanna's presentation as well. And so these linkages across conventions or acknowledgements of the co-benefits is sometimes already referenced in the NDC. And so I won't go into too much of the technical detail of it, but this would be or could be part of the ITCU, or the information to enhance transparency, clarity, and understanding around a mitigation target in the NDC. And this references the mitigation co-benefits of adaptation actions that are also part of the broader NDC. I mention this because of one of the things that Joanna mentioned in terms of the need to integrate ocean actions in things like the NDC, as well as the enhanced transparency framework. This is one way that governments or other stakeholders can support those actions that are more adaptation focused, but recognizing the mitigation contributions that they have. So the other example I'll mention here is from a mitigation perspective. In addition to the NDC, the greenhouse gas inventory or the national inventory report are critical documents that provide a level of detail that goes well beyond what's included in the NDC itself. These reports are essential to ensure the transparency and comprehensiveness and comparability of mitigation actions, as well as to provide the relevant information on land use changes, which is needed to be able to support the mitigation targets in an NDC or in the enhanced transparency framework for land use. And so to inform these reports, there are a few ways that governments or other stakeholder groups could engage. And this is by no means inclusive of everything, but these are a few examples, such as participating in capacity building workshops aimed at implementing or introducing the IPCC wetland supplement, or to work in collaboration with NGOs or other technical supports around coastal wetland carbon accounting. And I mentioned coastal wetlands in particular, given that it is currently the blue carbon ecosystems, mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes that have IPCC internationally approved guidance for greenhouse gas accounting. I should also mention that both of these examples that I just shared for mitigation and adaptation are taking the framing of nature-based solutions. And there are, of course, other ocean-based climate actions that could be incorporated in an NDC or other national reports that are equally important to ensure are well represented in the global stocktake. And these could range from renewable energy or to reducing emissions from fishing fleets or shipping. And in the coming months, WRI and RARE will be publishing a report on some of these broader ocean-based climate actions as it relates to the NDC. And so feel free to be in touch if you are interested in being notified when it's published and live. Beyond informing the governments and their national reports, how else can civil society and NGOs inform or contribute to the global stocktake process, especially given how complicated it seems from looking at it from the outside? Well, there are a number of touch points that have already been covered, whether that's participating in the technical dialogues or submitting inputs specifically or directly to the UNFCCC. But there are also a few other examples that are relevant for different stakeholders to engage in within or adjacent to the UNFCCC that still provide a space for civil society to be more directly involved at a thematic level beyond the negotiations. And a couple of these examples are on the screen. So to participate and to join the Marrakesh Partnership's Global Climate Action Agenda and its Ocean Pathway. At this upcoming COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, for example, there'll be an Ocean Action Day that's currently scheduled for Wednesday, November 16th, the last I heard. And there'll be a corresponding breakthrough lab, which will aim to take a deep dive into one of the priority themes outlined in this Ocean Pathway. And it's through these breakout labs that will ultimately be part of what the Marrakesh Partnership and the Global Climate Action Agenda puts forward in its report to the global stocktake. So that's one example of an area to informally participate in the global stocktake through that input process or indirect input process. Another example is for Nairobi Work Program partners, which the Nairobi Work Program is one of the adaptation arms of the UNFCCC. And within that negotiation stream, there is a thematic expert group, one of which is on oceans, that has a continued mandate to provide support to parties to reduce knowledge gaps on ocean climate adaptation issues. The expert group has created some knowledge products that we hope to support parties embark upon their own ocean climate adaptation efforts, and ultimately to be included in the global stocktake at that national level. The Nairobi Work Program expert group also has had the opportunity to inform and support the annual Ocean Climate Dialogue that we heard about earlier. And that's another way that we can engage annually, which is new and an incredibly valuable avenue that we heard about earlier. It's a platform for all parties and stakeholders with the intent to strengthen ocean action within the UNFCCC and to have a dedicated space for ocean climate issues, a space that's party-driven and providing meaningful support and action for municipal governments, for local communities, for national governments, for non-party stakeholders, for academia, all different varieties, all alike, being able to participate in this incredibly valuable dialogue space. And the summary report that was recently published outlines these key points. And I encourage you, if you haven't already downloaded it from Joanna's presentation, to take a look at the webpage and see more about what has taken place in the first dialogue and its related key messages and way forward. The last example I'll mention here is to utilize the support and to contribute to existing information platforms and other areas of research. And so one example is the Global Mangrove Watch, which recently launched a new version of having its latest available global data set with comprehensive mangrove area extent information that now goes through 2020. And again, this is one example. There are plenty of other areas where academia and other non-party stakeholders in the NGO space or other observers could start engaging in a collaboration that helps to support national priorities and local action. I would be remiss if I didn't make a plug for the very recently launched Global Mangrove Alliance's latest report on the state of the world's mangroves, which was released just last month. And the information in this report is another good example of the collaboration between NGOs, local organizations, and academia to bring the latest available mangrove data together in a publicly accessible format. And between this report and the Global Mangrove Watch platform, these were developed in lockstep with the intention of it being used by governments in developing their national reports, whether that's the NDC, the greenhouse gas inventory, or otherwise. So to conclude, the ocean and its coastal areas, both coastal-based nature-based solutions and other ocean-based climate actions are all essential elements that contribute to addressing climate change that benefit people and nature. And given the cross-cutting nature of ocean-based action for climate change, it's vital to ensure that these efforts are clearly articulated as an important factor in the global stocktake to inform future action and funding needs. So to that end, I'll close with 3 asks or action items for everyone here. So one, reiterating that ocean action is climate action and ocean financing is climate financing. Clearly articulating ocean and coastal actions and priorities in these relevant inputs and submissions for the global stocktake will ensure that the protection and sustainable management of the ocean ecosystems is part of the key messages to inform the discussions in the technical dialogue, to inform the high-level outcomes of the global stocktake, informing future NDC ambitions and future financing needs. 2, to think about how the information will be processed and to provide a summary page or something similar when submitting additional inputs, especially those that provide clear references to the official documents, as cross-checking will be necessary to uphold the integrity of the global stocktake while offering guidance to the Secretariat and reviewers, highlighting those important pieces of information that make it ocean relevant. And 3rd, to engage in the global stocktake. There are multiple points of entry for all stakeholders to engage throughout the process. And if we want to see the global stocktake meet its objective to assess progress and to inform future action, we need everyone to get involved and to communicate these outcomes that are relevant to each of your respective stakeholder groups. And that could range from local community level to universities, to local or national governments or beyond. And so thank you very much for your time and attention. And I look forward to the roundtable portion to discuss the global stocktake further, as well as other opportunities to further blue the Paris Agreement. So thank you very much.
Thank you as well, Lisa. That was very informative. I would also encourage everyone to read the report, and we look forward to your succeeding reports as well. Next, we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Philemon Manoni. He is the Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. Dr. Manoni has previously held the position of International Legal Advisor and has been responsible for providing legal policy advice and analysis on regional issues covered by the Secretariat since 2018. Prior to joining the Secretariat, Dr. Manoni was the Attorney General for the Republic of the Marshall Islands, providing both legal and policy analysis to the government on various matters, including regional and international treaties and agreements. Dr. Manoni also served as a legal advisor at the Pacific Islands Forum Fisheries Agency. He joins us today to share the perspectives of Pacific Island states with regards to oceans and climate change.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. And just checking whether you can hear me. Thanks.
Yes.
Well, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, and Bulavinaka, and very warm greetings from the Pacific. My name is Philemon Manoni, and I represent the Pacific Islands Forum this afternoon, and to join you at this workshop to discuss a very important topic from the perspective of the Pacific Islands, and more specifically, the Pacific Islands Forum as a family. And I wanted to strongly endorse the final comment by the last speaker on the ocean and climate nexus. And I think in my comments today, I will also be able to share with you some of the undertakings and the leaders' decisions on some of the work we do in connection with the oceans and climate nexus topic. But so I am indeed honored to be here on behalf of the Pacific Islands Forum to speak with you. As you know, this topic is one of very, very high importance to the Pacific. The Pacific Islands Forum leaders, in their successive annual meetings, and in July of this year, again reaffirmed that climate change remains the great threat facing the Blue Pacific, and underscoring the urgency to work very hard to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees through some real action. Sadly today, I think, as noted earlier by some speakers, the trajectory at which we are will no doubt lead us to meet this target. So I think the message is that to all of us, that a lot of work needs to be done, and real commitment to make sure that we remain on the 1.5 degree pathway is clearly urgent. And as a result of this, the leaders in the region have declared a climate emergency, an emergency that threatens the livelihoods, the security, the well-being of the peoples, the ecosystems. And this is not this is not an idea that is born out of a vacuum. This is, I think, as some of the speakers have referred to the special reports, and the science on this is clear. So while we continue to face the brunt of these adverse effects of climate change, we also hold the largest oceans in the world. And given that, I think one of our speakers referred to this in their comments about balancing the functionality of the ocean as a sink, but at the same time understanding the impacts of acidification and so forth. So the burden of climate change mitigation, shouldered by us in the region, is quite serious, particularly where the oceans is our economic base. This issue presents to us a triple threat to our ocean that causes it to become warmer, as I've mentioned a bit earlier, more acidic, less oxygen, and all of these challenges. The climate nexus is a critical issue for us in the Pacific. This is also espoused in a key document by leaders endorsed in July this year, our 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. It's key thematic areas of climate change, disasters, ocean, and natural environment. But what is the ocean's nexus? You see, and thank you for the previous speakers for outlining the scientific, the legal and technical issues and the nexus, climate change and the oceans. But for us in the Pacific, it is quite simple. The ocean to us serves as the soul, for many of us, as the sole breadbasket. It is the source of vitality for us. For generations, it has served our little communities, our islands, our nations. That is important to the Pacific. That is important to our people. And that is the reason that there is strong support by our leaders for oceans to be mainstreamed across the UNFCCC discourse. Oceans finance, as our last speaker said, is climate finance. We strongly agree with that proposition. So that is from our perspective, the importance of the ocean. To many of us, fisheries revenues represent close to 70% of annual budgets. That is important for our economies, for nation building, and for economic development as we look forward to the future. And as we aspire to achieve the ambitions that we have set for ourselves under the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. It is a concern. We have we have formulated and put in place a plethora of policy instruments, agreements, regional treaties to protect our resources in our oceans, to ensure the orderly enforcement of these processes so that we can benefit to the maximum in the resources due to us and accorded to us under the Law of the Sea Convention within our own exclusive economic zones, etc. So having laid this out, perhaps it'd be good to have a look at some of the key priorities and examples of the work that the Pacific Island Forum members are undertaking in terms of this ocean's climate nexus in the Pacific. And many of these are leader-based decisions, regional high-level policy decisions, recognizing, as I've said earlier, not only the legal and scientific connection, but the livelihoods of peoples in the Pacific and how and what the ocean means to us as a region and as a people. But so with regards to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement and our attendance at every COP every year. And I think we have to be very realistic about what we do. And the leaders continue to call on all parties to the Paris Agreement and all nations who emit to work a little bit harder to make sure that we continue on the path to the target 1.5 degrees. So in the same way, we are contemplating that COP27 in Egypt be different. COP27 must be an implementation COP. We must look to turning our pledges into real actions. We have to achieve something. We have to leverage on some of our past successes at 27, because the reports and the studies that we have seen do not paint a very favorable picture. So Pacific leaders have reaffirmed their commitment to fully implement the Paris Agreement, a collective aim to achieve carbon neutrality in the Pacific. Imagine that. And yet, the least of the emissions. But we are committed. And so we invite development partners, we invite all of us to support our cause and our Forum Island countries and our leaders' goal to do this. The leaders are committed to working together with COP27 President-designate in the lead up to COP27. Because we want to ensure that this COP is different, it delivers ambitious outcomes, that this COP enhances efforts by developed countries, at least to double their contribution, to give prominence to the work on the ocean and climate nexus, and to show some meaningful progress. No watering down of any outcome, as we unfortunately saw in 26. So these are some of the actions that we are thinking about, or that the leaders are thinking about ahead of COP27, and some of the items that we would like to bring across to COP27. The other, other item that was also raised in the last speaker was mainstreaming the oceans across the COP agenda. And one of the challenges, or one of the issues that the Pacific region is working on is to support an agenda on oceans in the upcoming COP. Because while, you know, the ocean is the biggest carbon sequestration mechanism, the ocean, as alluded to earlier, is climate. So the interaction with the climate, with the ocean, with the, for example, the acidification, for example, the impacts of sea level rise on the oceans. So we think that to leave the issue of oceans to the periphery would be a missed opportunity. The oceans need to be mainstream across all relevant agenda items at the COP. If you talk about financing, we should talk about oceans. When you talk about loss and damage, we talk about oceans. You talk about the global stocktake, as alluded to earlier. Capacity building, adaptation, technology transfer, mitigation, and the ocean, an integral part of the discussion. We are also calling for a dedicated 3-year work program under the Ocean Dialogue and pushing for high-level ministerial events at COP to get ministers of finance to have a look at ocean action and rapid carbon emissions for the ocean sector. We have at the regional level initiatives on shipping and commitment to energy efficiency. We have incentives to take this up at the global level in order to contribute as our contribution to not only the climate change debate, but also to the oceans. The The other issue, I think that's been discussed very over and over again, then something that is important to the Pacific is the issue of loss and damage. We see this as indeed a defining issue for us at the upcoming COP. The unrelenting impacts of climate change has made us realize that we can't go on to every COP and not come out with anything. Because while we are at the forefront of this issue and debating this issue, impacts of climate change don't wait for us to finish our negotiations. So it is critical, we see, that the question of loss and damage be addressed comprehensively at the next COP. We need to secure an agenda item on loss and damage to ensure that there are clear outcomes to move us forward. Of course, the need to establish a facility, a financial facility, for instance, and also effort to operationalize the Santiago network. I come to an issue that is of very great interest to us as well. And that is something I alluded to earlier in my earlier comments, and that is of sea level rise and the climate connection. Because in the region, there is no theory, there is no rhetoric. It's reality. We are living this every day. We are seeing the changes in our coastal islands, erosion, regression of coastlines, which has the potential to destabilize the legal boundaries, the baselines from which we mark our boundaries, our zones, our maritime zones. This calls into question even to, in some cases, existence of sovereign countries. As large ocean states, we have built our nations, our development, and on the reliance of the rights and entitlements guaranteed to us as states parties and as coastal states under the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention. In 2021, Pacific leaders announced a groundbreaking declaration, and that is a normative declaration on preserving maritime zones in the face of climate change-related sea level rise. This declaration clarifies our position that once our maritime zones are established in accordance with the convention, this will be maintained as long as with rights and entitlements that flow from these maritime zones without reduction or derogation, notwithstanding any physical changes to the climate-related sea level rise. We believe this to be important to us, that it is supported by the convention and the principles of general international law that underlie the convention. And we believe that this promotes legal stability, security, certainty, and predictability in how we manage our oceans, how we manage the resources within these maritime zones in accordance with the tenets of the Law of the Sea Convention. And then on this note, I should acknowledge the immense support from organizations and countries of this declaration. And so we hope that there would be a greater support, that we will work together to make sure that we have rights granted to us under international law remain intact. So that declaration was endorsed in 2021 by the forum leaders, and we are now working with other countries also to seek to invite support toward that end. I have two more items to share with you. One is the effort that is currently being, the initiative that is currently led by Vanuatu at the United Nations. And the idea is to seek a resolution of the UNGA for an advisory opinion from the ICJ on the obligation of states under international law. That work is led by Vanuatu and is ongoing, but that has received the support of the forum leaders and others as well. My final point to share with you today, although not directly a climate issue, but I think it is relevant, at least from the perspective of the Pacific Islands, because we live with it. We know the impacts of it, etc. And this is to do with the legacy of past nuclear testings in the region, its impacts on the environment in the oceans and resources. Recently, also unfortunate, but the accident to the Fukushima nuclear power plant also is a concern to us. Leaders remain troubled by the government of Japan's plans to discharge over 1 million tons of nuclear treated water from the Fukushima into the ocean. We are concerned mostly about the transboundary and transgenerational nature of these impacts, particularly nuclear waste discharge. This is not fear that is derived from a vacuum, but we live with this legacy. But on this issue, we are engaging with the government of Japan to see how that issue could be resolved in the near future. So, as intended, I have, I think, highlighted some of the key priorities and policy positions of the region on the work around the ocean and climate nexus in the region. Connected by oceans, the universal and impacts of climate change, and the challenges posed by crisis to our ocean. So I trust that these perspectives have been helpful in our discussions. And of course, we be happy to answer some questions if there is a need to. So I thank you for the opportunity to share this with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Manoni. It is always critical to hear from those that are most affected by the impacts of climate change, to put our work into perspective and, of course, emphasize the urgency that is needed for ambitious climate action. So up next, we have Dr. Srivatsan Raghavan. He's a Principal Research Fellow and Head of Climate and Weather Research at the NUS Tropical Marine Science Institute. His primary research is climate science, including climate modeling and climate change impacts. Currently, he holds a joint appointment with the NUS Department of Geography, where he teaches courses related to weather and climate change. He is also a core researcher at the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. Dr. Shi will present preliminary information on the status of climate change in Southeast Asia, followed by discussions on climate governance, the need for better implementation of climate policies, and some pointers on nature-based solutions.
Yeah, hi, Raila. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to the organizing committee for bringing me on board this event. And it's fantastic to listen to some of you with different insights on the climate policy. I've learned something also from this because I'm more an atmospheric scientist working on climate change and climate impacts in Singapore about for 15 years now. So I would be brief in this event, and I want to focus more on sharing a little of my experience in working on climate change as such in Southeast Asia. and where I think there could be more impetus to climate governance, where there could be more done in terms of bringing people together for better policy implementation. And nowadays, because the nature-based climate solutions is being widely spoken about, I think that is something that I would like to end my talk with. So before that, let me share my screen. And to give you a perspective of where we are, just because of we speak widely about carbon dioxide. This is where we are at the moment. So the global carbon dioxide concentration is about 420, close to 420. This is the Earth CO2 website, which probably if you're interested, you can Google. And they have this information updated probably every month. And they also have this information just out of curiosity. So July 2022 has been one of the highest record-breaking temperatures since 1880. So that's once again putting our context why we are here. We were concerned about atmospheric carbon dioxide. And there's also because I work on atmospheric climate change mostly. So it's of interest to look at what is the carbon dioxide concentration globally. Given the context of Southeast Asia and ASEAN, once again, I want to highlight that not only the climate projections which we work on in Singapore at the National University of Singapore, but also from many of the studies in the region and what the IPCC gives about is that the Asia-Pacific region sees a greater number of weather-related disasters than other regions with increasing frequency and severity. This is also kind of an urgency that that I have been listening for more than 10 years since all these modeling efforts have been concentrated here in this region, and that the Southeast Asian region needs much more effort in both science and in mitigation is new. So I'm sure you know this, but I want to place this in the context of our discussions this evening. And therefore, tagging along the Paris Agreement's international conventions, the ASEAN's mitigation goal is to achieve net zero as early as possible in the later half of the 21st century, but to cap peak global, the greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible after 2030 to ensure that this goal is met on schedule. But then there's a flip side to that, is that the nationally determined contributions NDC targets shown in the outlook are really inconsistent to meet the above, and therefore there's an urgent need to transform the energy and land use systems if we really want to tag along the lines of the Paris Agreement. So this is a policy brief, a recent one early this year coming from IGES, Japan, and they have highlighted this from the data available and from the status of climate change mitigation in the Southeast Asian region. Well, we know that this is the climate impacts that we have been seeing here, and worrisome are the recent droughts as much as floods. This isn't new because we have been hearing the episodes of droughts and floods for a long time, but there seems to be a very strong observational support, and that we have been observing in local ASEAN context is that the rising sea levels is really damaging the low-lying deltas like Mekong Delta with the saltwater intrusion, and they're also hit by floods. And regions like Indonesia and Thailand have seen a lot of droughts, which is also altering our food supplies. Food security is getting kind of a big concern. We used to be concerned more about floods and droughts just because of the loss of properties and lives, but now food security is being added as an extra dimension in terms of urgency. So this needs to be even taken up further by all the countries, I guess. But although this climate change dilemma has been existing in Southeast Asia, and we know that carbon dioxide is the root cause of these, and all these figures, all these statistics there on screen, one thing to highlight is this, that the greenhouse gas emissions are to increase by 60% if the mitigation policies are not implemented. So this comes back to the point of discussion in this talk, that we have climate governance as one of the impediments in really achieving what we want to. The readiness in some of the ASEAN countries is also given by the Southern ASEAN Post, which is a good one to keep an eye on. Now, although here the legend says there are pioneers emerging in wait-and-see approach, the pioneers in the sense that relative to some of the other countries in Southeast Asia, there's a bit more effort in terms of doing something on the ground. So while some countries have been still emerging and some people still have this wait-and-see approach for this adaptation readiness. So this is also a kind of a conflict which I feel is a problem. Unless we bring them all at some level, especially the wait-and-see approach seems to be delaying a lot of things, is to put them on war footing and say that collectively there has to be something done for Southeast Asia and ASEAN countries, which I think is still under a lot of deliberations. It doesn't seem to go anywhere. The ASEAN State of Climate Change report, which was released recently, it says all this. I mean, we do have drafted the best policies. We have brought in experts to discuss this, and they have all been outlined clearly like this, just to provide an outlook on climate change in a regional context, which we are doing, focusing on adaptation and mitigation actions at various levels. This is being discussed, but it's not in its full form. We also have a good understanding of the gaps. Whenever we speak about the challenges in this region, we also speak about the gaps. We have data gaps, we have technical gaps, of course, notwithstanding the financial gaps. We have identified them. We are trying to put everything together, but most of these are on a national scale. So when I have spoken to other counterparts in the region, there's a lot of initiatives and documentation and master plans which are going around in terms of identifying the needs and challenges. But I still believe that they are not discussed on a wider range, just to see if there's anybody to help within the region or where they can learn from what the other nations have done to promote this bigger cooperation. The report does say that, but implementation is still far from where we want to have that. As you can see that the Paris Agreement long-term goals after 2050, we still have that. We have the gaps, good practices here, as you can see, but yeah, the pathway which we want to say is the acquaint, integrate, involve, and motivate. That's a definition which has been put forward by the ASEAN, and we are still there. We are self-realizing, self-enforcing sort of things, but it's just that the graph just shows that we are a long way to go, because this is the current status of ASEAN, which means in terms of transformation and transparency and moving ahead to meet these goals until about at least the mid-century, I think we have a bigger challenge here. I'll skip this slide due to time limits, but it's once again puts forward how we have described all these 4 challenges clearly. Coming to climate governance, and that's where once again the gaps and opportunities are being felt, but we haven't done much. And I'm referring to one of these recent studies done at the Southeast Asian Studies Institute. It's a good paper to look into, is that the ASEAN regional climate officials too have always suggested that they have a problem in obtaining industry cooperation in helping meeting the targets, mitigation targets on the and also on the adaptation front. They face all this community level problems. Well, this is two-sided, but I would say that although this is still a part of the problem, I also feel that countries like Laos have taken to a lot of community-based disaster risk management, CBDRM as it's defined. It's also happening at some places in Cambodia and Laos. I have been a part of the Asian Development Bank project, which was in Laos. They undertook this community-based disaster risk management in terms of climate change and addressing flooding. So probably, I think there are missing gaps, not only in this, but it's like the left hand doesn't know what right hand is doing. A lot more being done at the community level, village level, but it's not fully translating into a regional level. In terms of national policies, these are very clear. These are documented. The central government in each country does give the aid for all these programs to be followed upon and being implemented, but there isn't a common portal of sharing this information, which clearly defines that there is an institutional gap. I mean, the chief institutional gap is like there is no super coordinating body that we have. This is also stressed in terms of different people in Singapore, or even in discussions coming up with this. We don't have a common platform to bring everyone together. This is also a limitation when atmospheric climate scientists, as I go around talking to people about, we need to really have a clear idea of what's going to be happening in climate change in Southeast Asia. We do have all this from the IPCC. We have some ideas about where the temperature is going to go, how is the rainfall, what's the rainfall patterns, also on the scientific sides of climate change. We do not yet have a coordinating body. We do have Codex, which is an international body organized by the World Meteorological Organization and World Climate Research Program, bringing it to say identify challenges for Southeast Asia. But I do feel that there's less scientific studies done in this region, little initiatives on the modeling side and the climate side, the science side. And we always say, I'm a scientist, so I'm not more on the policy, but I do see that there should be a strong synergy between the science and policy when we want to talk together. There are more policy people in the government side. That's the way the civil service is organized. But I think there is still a paucity in terms of the number of climate science people here to push things and to make this sort of a super coordinating body. Like we should have a sort of small IPCC here, sort of a mini version or something, and just bring both the science people and the policy people and say, okay, we have the science here. We have all this in front. Now we want to coordinate everyone to come under one umbrella platform to make all these implementation on policies. So they talk to each other and say, where are these gaps? What does the scientists convey? What is that they know? Although I'm sure also admit that the climate scientists also do not know what is happening on the policy side and vice versa. So, which means that there needs to be a coordinating body here. Sharing of data is a big problem that also limits so it's transparency, and we don't know what's happening from one country to the other. And then when you group everything together on a regional level, there's a big problem because the sharing of the data is not really easy and it's not quite open. So there should be some other, probably using a super coordinating body, this could be easily facilitated. So we know who's really having deep trouble and how can we help them? Or is there any other lessons or help that we can take from neighboring countries? So coming into climate governance, I think this chart is showing some of the questions we really ask, like, do we understand the problem? What would be the outcome of these? What are the performance indicators? Have we done a proper evaluation of all this? Where is the policy taking us? Do we have enough monitoring platforms, reporting mechanisms, most of all? Even the reporting mechanisms are more country specific, so we don't get them probably on a common platform. So there is a problem there. And this one, which we all can relate to. So before we have this kind of governance problem or policy discussion problem, we are trying to address these objectives, is to see whether the policy will work, whether it will work, whether we have the baseline data, first of all. And I think when we come to baseline data, some of these countries really need much more data. Some of them are lost forever. If you look at the past, so we don't know how to benchmark the future with reference to the past. And then finally, of course, we want to work towards it. We don't know how to work on it. And then after delivery, there are also some problems to see, did it really work? Who gained from it? Did other country really work it and make it a success story? And then whether can we also implement that on the other side? A good example was shared by one of the researchers from the University of Malaya, is this transboundary haze problem. Well, this is not really a climate problem, but the case study, I think, is well demonstrated for an example. So this shows the time event of what happened with the transboundary issue to just solve it in climate governance. So it says that the policies kept on changing when the governments also kept changing. So once a master plan is drafted and then the governance changes and then it's weakened and weakened. So if you see here, we have had COVID and then finally the laws are scrapped, saying that we do have enhanced cooperation, but then nothing was really implemented, or we just don't know how it's going to move forward if we were to have a different governance. So this is a case which tells that we need probably somebody to continue the policies which have been formed for the good, for the region and for the country to move it forward, irrespective of the change in policies or governments. But that I think is a problem not only for Southeast Asia, but anywhere else. This also demonstrates that climate governance is being hit by some of these geopolitical issues. Yeah. Yes, so one of the biggest challenges we have is in the democratic process of governmental change is ensuring policy continuity, because that is important for environmental resilience. So we speak about implementing all these Paris agreements or whatever initiatives that Southeast Asia is taking under the ASEAN umbrella. We do have this discontinuity here and there. Therefore, the absence of this culture of policy continuity can be a significant limitation when we speak about regional resilience. So we speak first about the national resilience and then put everything together, we do have a problem in a regional resilience. So then we have to keep saying this for the next 10 years or 20 years or so, and then we still have the same problem. Well, I have been doing this, telling my students when I say, okay, during my PhD times, we had this climate change problem that was 20 years ago. But even after 20 years ago, I lecture my students, I still tell them, oh, we still have to do much more. There's still much more policy problems. There's still finance problems. So we have crossed a very small length, relatively speaking. And when we speak about the nature-based climate solutions, which is really gaining momentum in Southeast Asia, I should say there's one thing which I want to highlight is that although the others, in terms of biodiversity, we know the problem of climate change, we know the priorities, actions, I think there is a problem in integrating the commitments to international conventions and the relevant national policies that result in climate adaptation and mitigation benefits. So this is one of the recommendations which was put forward by the World Wildlife Fund. And we do see this problem of integrating these commitments and honoring these national policies. This is a very hot slide, which I got this was online only yesterday. And it's a study which tells challenges to implementing nature-based climate solutions in Asia, which of course it also includes Southeast Asia here. So we do have a climate adaptation policy for countrywide thing, but it's well addressed in national strategies, policies, and international financing mechanisms, but not regionally. So we have a problem there. And therefore, when we have the ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, there's a poor link. And that link is because the linkage between the eco-DRR and the domestic governance is poor, and the financial mechanisms for incorporating how this is going to be affected needs further clarification, which isn't still clear. So once again, money comes as a big problem, although we know that we have the green financing mechanisms or green climate funds, but we need a better understanding of how it can be implemented in Southeast Asia. And one other limitation is some of these nature-based climate solutions are more focused on urban areas, in my perspective, because we discussed a lot in Singapore, but in a regional context, I would say that they are not really discussed in terms of wider landscapes, seascapes, the coasts. When we speak about coastal protection, of course, Singapore is also quite active, so we do a lot of adaptation and planning for coastal resilience or coastal protections. But for other countries for which NBS may be a bigger thing, so region-wise, area-wise, you have a different geography. It should be even beyond the urban areas. So I think that is still a bit of an infant stage, as far as I know. So that needs a better coordination. And discussion on cross-sectoral strategies, such as post-pandemic green recovery, has not been intensive. We need to further that. While some countries have incorporated the eco-DRR in their national strategies, once again, the governance domestically within that country and the measures for implementation are still poor. And therefore, there's no consensus on what NBS for infrastructure is needed. It just does remain difficult to establish national policies and the financial mechanisms for the implementation of such nature-based climate solutions. So with that, let's stop here. So it's more of my perspective is, although we know that climate change is quite a serious one, we all understand that's why we're here. My question in working in this region for quite a long time is in governance, in bringing people together, sharing a common platform, and being consistent in getting this through is a big problem. So once again, the governance and lack of a coordinating body seems to be one of the biggest problems. Probably if we have that, and then we can take all this and push faster. So let me stop here. Over to you, Rayla.
Thank you, Dr. Sri, for that informative presentation and sharing the regional perspective. We have invited a representative from the COP27 presidency to join us today, but unfortunately they had to send their regrets given the informal pre-COP summit currently being held in Kinshasa. But they wish us all the best as we discuss these important issues for COP27 and beyond. And so now we have reached the roundtable discussion portion of the workshop. May I please welcome back all our speakers as well as Daniel Yao, who will be the moderator for the discussion. As earlier mentioned, the audience is welcome to post their questions via the chat box below.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to welcome and to thank all the various distinguished speakers for a very, I would say it's a really stimulating, a very engaging, robust discussion across a whole range of issues. And it's been a very rich discussion, even though it's only been like about 2 hours so far, or just under 2 hours. We've really covered a lot of ground. And I'm sure the participants who are online in this webinar, there's been some comments, a lot of positive comments about the presentations. And I do encourage them to please post the questions you may have as we spend the next perhaps 20 to 30 minutes on this session. And I invite Petra to join us and welcome you to join us as well. Thank you in this exciting session, as well as Dr. Philemon as well. So what have we done in this past 2 hours? And just to quickly summarize, we started with Nilofer's question. Where is the ocean in the climate discussion? And has that question been answered? Or has it been answered to your satisfaction? And that is probably the first question I will pose to Nilofer. And then next we have Joanna's sort of a response and a summation, a description of what has happened and what have you described very aptly as a long process, but it's getting there, and we are there. And where can we go from here? And a lot of very useful pointers as to intersection. Lisa, thank you very much also for sharing this important work and also showing us the different intersection points, as you say, the different avenues, the different areas, the different, very practical, I would say, a very practical insight that I hope the government representatives and also non-state actors, civil society and academia will find very useful as we proceed the next course. Dr. Manoni, thank you very much for a very important intervention, bringing together and bringing us back to a broader, larger geopolitical issues as well, and a very important perspective of the countries in a particular region or particularly affected, and a whole range of considerations beyond just oceans and GST, but really oceans, climate, and oceans beyond climate, where there are interlinkages, perhaps not necessarily or always discussed or even appropriately discussed in the UNFCCC forum, but nonetheless very important background that we cannot leave out of our consideration, and we need to be discussed as well, regardless of whichever forum. And then finally, Dr. Srivatsan, thank you for bringing us back to the science, which is really the ground and the foundation. As lawyers, we can talk of many things and policy.
Yeah, I was really thinking I was an outsider in this.
Not
I know
at
all
all.
advisor and
Not
policy
at all.
people. I was really hesitant to be coming as a scientist here.
No, I was very educated by your intervention because really the science grounds a lot of this discussion. Sure. And you're sharing of the perspective as to what is happening in ASEAN, or rather what you feel is not happening enough in ASEAN, may hold salutary lessons, I think, for everyone in whatever regions that they come in. So I thought that was a useful discussion overall, of a huge journey that we have come on. And so now we come to I hope to be a very engaging and to and fro questions and engaging discussion. And there are really two broad points that we want to cover in this 30 minutes. And the first broad point is really the larger question of the intersection and the nexus between oceans and climate. And to what extent these issues could possibly develop in the international law arena, and how the various issues, and I think Dr. Manoni talks about sea level rise, talks about broader questions of environmental protection. So to what extent do these issues intersect? And the second broad basket questions you want to deal with is really drilling down to the question of GST and the global stocktake. And what is the role of oceans, and how can the participants in this forum, or what can they learn from this process? What are the good practices to be shared? And what are the issues that we need to think about collectively to input and to really build in the role or the mainstreaming of oceans into the GST. So perhaps, Nilofer, if I could start with you with your provocative question, would you have a response to what have we heard so far? Are you satisfied with where we are in the oceans? What else do you think could be done, particularly from the international and oceans point of view? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Danielle. And can I simply echo what you've said? I'm so glad that I actually was part of this workshop, not to hear myself, frankly, but I have to congratulate each and every one of the speakers. I learned a lot. It was extremely informative. And I'm very happy that we also had the science. And this is something, as I was listening to you, how much more we should be engaging with you actually on this, because you can't do climate change in the ocean without the science. And so, getting back to your question, I think that was kind of the point I was making, was that from 1990 until 2022, the science has been very clear that the ocean was at risk, that the adverse impacts on the ocean. And I think it's important, and Dr. Manoni really highlighted this. This is not abstract. People are actually are suffering from this. This has genuine impacts on livelihood of people. So here the science has been there, and yet at the global governance, not us, in the global governance, where's the ocean? The UNFCCC, one article, and I said it's a functional one because it's really, how do we use the ocean? It's not how do we save the ocean, although I understand that it includes the, not even the clear-cut duty, but a should duty to sustainably manage them. And then the Paris Agreement by Paris, 2015, oodles of science, including ocean acidification. And nothing there. So yes, the good news is after, let's see, I can't do the math, from 1990 to 2016, we finally are seeing the ocean being taken seriously. And it's entering, although not mainstream, because it's all dialogues, it's all quite soft. But this is starting. So I'm happy to see that there is really increase of the profile of oceans in the UNFCCC system. But I'm just going to make one comparison. Look at forests, look at land use. We're nowhere near that. I think we really need to retch up the place of beyond dialogues. It's a beginning, I understand that. But we really have to have action measures that are going to actively mitigate carbon dioxide in the ocean. Because right now, as it is, I see it that the process is more making the ocean an indirect beneficiary, frankly. And I think we need to have much more in terms of indicators, in terms of ambition. Yes, it's great they're in the NDCs, but it's not required. So I think we really need to get more, and that brings me to international law. I think we have to bring it more into, I don't want to say hard obligations, but at this point, I think we really need to drive the responsibility of states to take active measures with specific targets that are really going to have an impact on the ocean, because it is truly something that is threatening all livelihoods, frankly. So I'll stop here because I want to hear more from the other speakers. But so my answer is we're on our way, but no, not adequate.
Thank you, Nilofer, for that response. I mean, I was looking for the quote from Joanna, which I found a very useful report. Because her comment was, "Where the oceans is there, it's been hiding in plain sight," as you say. I think that was what you mentioned. And thank you for illuminating that. And I guess maybe I could follow up from Nilofer's point, and perhaps over to you, Joanna. As you know, this calls for oceans to have a great file. In one of the participants asked the question, is oceans on the agenda of COP27. And perhaps you could address that question in the context of what Niloufar just mentioned, which is kind of soft as a dialogue. It's not really the formal agenda. So how is one to approach that, and what can we really expect next on oceans? And I guess that's kind of linked to the question, which was one of the questions that we kind of shared in advance, which is really, would the implementation of oceans climate policies under UNFCCC, would that lead to conflict potentially with other areas of international law regimes? And Petra, feel free to comment on that, because I think that's, and Niloufar as well, I'm sure you have views on that point. But I'm very interested in Joanna's views on what next, and really, is it part of the agenda? How are we supposed to view this oceans as hiding in plain sight, which nobody seems, there still seems to be a lot of question. Is it there? You say it's hiding in plain sight, but many are still questioning its status. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And there's a lot of history behind the COP26 decision, and there was an attempt to introduce it as an agenda item between now or pre COP26, but after Paris, which didn't really take traction. And there's a couple of reasons for that. In some ways, it doesn't need to be negotiated. It needs to be acted. So in some ways, there's no need to negotiate the importance of ocean and the importance of acting to protect the ocean, and the need for ocean-based action. Those are two sides of the same thing. So there's a reason for that, but there's also, out of COP26, it was a process orientated decision. It was this push for this holistic approach across the UNFCCC, this opportunity, if you like, for all work streams to consider how ocean can be put in their work, whether it's a constituted bodies work program, or it's, as Lisa mentioned, the Nairobi work program, which has an expert group that is really quite a powerful one in promoting some of these conversations around nature-based solutions and ocean action, and they have policy briefs coming out of that work. So moving towards COP27, there is no official landing space, if you like, which an agenda item on the ocean. However, there is this opportunity for parties to take on board what is coming out of the work that's happened over the last year, from constituted body reports, from work streams, from the ocean dialogue, which is this opportunity to really push some of these messages that don't need to be negotiated, they just need to be advocated for. And so the opportunity at COP27 is for parties to decide in their conversations around the overarching decision out of COP27 what they would like to consider, such as the outcomes from the ocean dialogue, such as the Lisbon Declaration, such as, you know, this urgency for countries to consider the need to marry ocean and climate action for sustainable development in the overarching decision text. But it's not a fait accompli. So it's in the hands of parties, of course, to decide what they wish to see coming out of the COP27 overarching decision around this conversation.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Perhaps before I go back to Petra, maybe it's a good segue if I can turn to Dr. Manoni, because Joanna ended on that point. It's really up to the parties what they're going to want to see out of this in COP27. What do you think? What would you like to see from the perspective of PIF, and how do you anticipate this discussion to go? Perhaps a little hint as to what's going to happen in COP27.
Thank you. Well, you know, I think the thinking is to give the oceans more prominence than just a dialogue. And what we're looking for, at least from the perspective of the Pacific, noting what the ocean is to many of us, not only Pacific, but all of us around the region who are similarly situated geographically and ecologically. To do that, and the challenge for us is that I think the connection to the incoming presidency, unlike COP26, where the line of communications with the UK government was quite a good one. And, we did have some sessions leading up to COP26 where we exchanged ideas and conveyed what the Pacific thought should happen at the COP. But there has been some contact, and I think through our members, also through the forum, the SG, some of these ideas we are trying to get across to the incoming COP presidency. What we would like to see is, I know hearing from our speaker that it would be a challenge, but getting oceans on the agenda is sort of what we as a region are looking at. Because as you say, we can't pretend that ocean is not there. It's out there in plain sight, but it's sort of the elephant in the room, so to speak. Nobody wants to touch it for whatever reason. But I think there is a very strong correlation, and that the reason why we should have a look at oceans, give it some prominence on the agenda, rather than relegate that to some dialogue, and then to have a look at some later stage what that could look like. So I think the interest from our region, from the Pacific Islands Forum region, is to see a more serious discussion on the nexus of the oceans. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manoni, for sharing that insight. As one of the potential perhaps moves or advocacy that we will continue to see in COP27. And of course, with the current sort of a global climate, with the geopolitical insecurities, energy insecurity, is a real question as to what really will be the focus now of COP27, given the global security climate and the energy crisis that we are all kind of facing as a result of what's happening over in Russia, in Russia and Ukraine. Now, before I move to the global stocktake specific issues, Petra, if I could turn to you to see if you have any comment on really the question of, are there any implications from the legal perspective of bringing in oceans into essentially a climate framework where there are really oceans related governance in other frameworks, in other forums, UNCLOS, so on, CBD, other areas. How do you see this potentially working together or working against each other? And then I'll be very interested in your thoughts on this as well, as both eminent public international lawyers and academics. Very important issue, and one that would trouble many governments as well. How do they navigate important issues without kind of disrupting or destabilizing the existing international legal regime? Another elephant in the room, I think it might. Petra, over to you, and then.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and thank you to all speakers for the fantastic presentations. I found this very enriching this morning, and I'm absolutely delighted that I could be part of this. I've learned a lot. I've got a specific question for Joanna, but I will address the question that you've asked me, Danielle, first. So I did actually think at one point, do we have to shift the focus and maybe concentrate on UNCLOS more than on the Paris Agreement currently when we want to protect the oceans? But if we want to make this work under the Paris Agreement, I think there are probably a few aspects where we could develop even a more legal obligation emerging. We need to do some creative thinking perhaps. And I found Lisa's comment really striking, to have in the ICTU NBS indicators, which as far as I see, we don't have those included at the moment. So that would mean we would need to develop or understand that there is a due diligence obligation of states perhaps to include this. So I was wondering, and maybe that is more common than a question, if it would be then possible to perhaps go along the lines of subsequent state practice in the interpretation of treaties and say that we see as good practice emerging in some NDCs or in the information provided with the NDCs, that states include these indicators and also include how they measure progress. So again, it would go back to the self-perception of states. I can see that as a problem, but it would perhaps allow us to argue that we see over time at least an emerging obligation even of states through the subsequent state practice that they interpret the ICTU or PRIDE in a way that they include NBS indicators. And maybe the ocean could even be the prime example for it. There seems to be a very long process, though. I think, you know, to have a long enough time pass, and especially since the ICTU only needs to be applied now for the second round of NDCs, so it's only an obligation for the second round. I think this is probably a very time-intensive process. Now, as an alternative, and this is probably where the question for Joanna comes in, NBS are now for the first time really discussed under Article 6.8, and I was wondering whether you see any leverage to use it or make it more pronounced there and introduce the oceans as well more into that particular process of discussing and construing some meaningful conversations and maybe outcomes under Article 6.8 on the non-market frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. I will definitely love to hear from Joanna on the question. I wonder if Nilofer had anything you wanted to comment on the question, firstly on the interaction between different international regimes as we bring oceans, and if oceans comes more and more into the climate agenda, are there any risks or any benefits or risks that or issues the governments need to be particularly mindful of as they navigate this terrain?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a big issue that has been looked at, and I think, you know, the ocean in the UNFCCC system, for example, sea level rise, which is really an UNCLOS issue in terms of the maritime zones and baselines. But when we look at the broader picture of the impact of ocean acidification, ocean warming on the marine environment, there's no question that UNCLOS comes into play. But the problem is that the UNFCCC has a system, a process. UNCLOS doesn't have it. You know, the whole process under the SBSTA, you know, everything there that can really move things forward collectively, because we can only address these issues collectively. And so that's why it's really a challenge how to do that under UNCLOS as well. And that's where I'm going to say that we do need the science, and picking up on the whole issue that, you know, Lisa was also mentioning, that on the indicators, we have nothing really. You know, how are we going to, oh, well, we need to understand it better. And that's why I brought in forests, you know, LULUCF and all of that has been very integrated into the climate process under the UNFCCC. We don't see that corollary with ocean. And that's what I think we need to see. But you know, this is a big topic. We can have another session just on that.
Thank you very much, Nilofer. And I think this is a great segue for Lisa and Sri to come in on the science, and also to come in on the specific inputs and indicators, which very usefully set out in Lisa's presentation. Joanna, before I do that, do you want to come in on Petra's question to you, so that we don't forget that, and the very important question of the link to section Article 6?
It is an important question, and I think science plays a very important role in that conversation. So the IPCC inventories very clearly outline the 3 blue carbon systems, which have enough scientific underlying emission factors that can be reported in terms of mitigation action by parties to the UNFCCC. I would strongly suggest, not just speaking as a former scientist, but also in someone that works in this science policy interface, that a lot more science needs to go into understanding how other ecosystems can be used for mitigation. Adaptation, ecosystem restoration, ecosystem protection is extremely important as an adaptation measure, even with co-benefits. I'm sure Lisa can back me up on a lot of this. And I think that is where a lot of the advocacy really in the ocean conversation needs to come forward. And this is something that was also discussed at the Ocean Dialogue in June, that this is where the finance gap is really hitting hard. To bring the ocean ecosystems into this conversation, to bring the fisheries into this conversation from an adaptation perspective. In terms of Article 6, yes, I think, well, as a climate scientist, I would say, you know, we need to urgently reduce emissions to protect the ocean. But the ocean is a space where that action can happen. In terms of emissions trading, I cannot really make a comment on that. I would just strongly suggest that further science is needed so that there is a scientific backing for any carbon trading that takes place under that article. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rana. Lisa, can I turn over to you in terms of what has been discussed in the earliest in this dialogue, and also coming back to your work on this area. You know, any lessons you can draw that you can shed light on, and in particular when we talk about matrices and that should be included in NDCs. What do you think is missing so far from your work that you have seen, and what do you think has been done well, which perhaps needs to be a light needs to be shone on it as an example, as good practice for others, and which, in particularly with the science, we have scientists here. You know, where can scientists continue to contribute to this process? Where are the gaps?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good series of questions, and sorry that the light is such right now. So I'll start with connecting a bit with what Joanna was just sharing on Article 6 and 6.8 in particular, and connecting that with your first question on what might be missing based from our conversations here, from what I've seen, as well as within the broader conversation in this space and going forward. And so one of those is, as Joanna hinted at, is around the co-benefits of mitigation actions, particularly that in a nature-based solution approach. So any coastal and marine ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solution efforts that would be around conservation, restoration, or sustainable management. We want to be able to better articulate and understand what the co-benefits are from an adaptation and a resilience perspective. Those are the types of impacts that we feel at the local community level. It's also what we feel and what we see coming out as important priorities at the national level. And the linkage there to 6.8 is that from the mitigation side, as Joanna mentioned, we do have IPCC guidance for mangroves, for seagrasses, and for tidal salt marshes, so the blue carbon ecosystems. And similarly, those ecosystems, when you are conserving or you're sustainably managing them, you have mitigation benefits and you also have adaptation benefits. And so the Article 6.8 conversation around non-market mechanisms are particularly important to be able to capture those conversations. But similar to what was said earlier, from a market perspective and from a mitigation perspective, we want to ensure that additional ecosystems do have more science behind it before diving into something that's emission trading or other types of trading units. But that said, what we can start with, and what I think that this group and what this conversation can lead to is better articulation of those co-benefits. What are the adaptation indicators? What are the ecosystem-based adaptation indicators? What are some of the resilience indicators around food security and coastal resilience? Those are critical components that would be incredibly beneficial to be even more part of those conversations around ocean-based climate action. I believe some of the around your second question, I believe, was what have we done well, and I think that I think that one of the things that we've done really well is starting to demystify this, where is the ocean in the UNFCCC? And I know I say this a bit lightly, I guess, because we're still working on better articulating and pulling out the elements from that are hiding in plain sight, as Joanna mentioned. But I think that we are making very significant progress on that. And similarly, being able to highlight where the ocean is part of the existing conversation. Well, there's a lot more to do. And I think the dialogue is one of those starting points to be able to better understand and strengthen those existing spaces, whether that's the Nairobi Work Program's expert group on oceans products that come out that are intended to support the needs of parties, as well as conversations around the Standing Committee on Finance, because we all know that finance is a huge need for ocean-based climate actions or nature-based solutions in general. And there's a number of other spaces that are like this. We can share, there's a policy paper that outlines some of these specific options within the context of the UNFCCC that will be coming out before COP, which we can make sure that this group also gets a copy of, to see those specific items and areas of potential action to better strengthen the ocean climate nexus. And the last point on the process that I'll mention is that it is a process, and it's a stepwise one. And so being able to have the dialogue was a huge success, to be able to start by having this conversation and bringing all relevant stakeholders together. What we'll want to see moving forward is how to ensure that it moves beyond just being a dialogue, and to have something that's meaningful and valuable for parties. And so that is the intention of it, and it's moving in that direction, which is a fantastic way forward. I think the last point that I'll mention that I believe covers some of your question about where can the science benefit this conversation beyond the indicator point. I'll also mention that there is a further area that is, I want to say emerging, but it's been emerging, about the need to understand how these different indicators and reporting structures relate to each other across forums. So you mentioned UNCLOS, but also we have the Paris Agreement and its relevant reporting requirements, as well as the emerging UN Convention on Biological Diversity's post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will have its own set of indicators and targets. And so there is a need to be able to think about how do we reduce reporting barriers and identify these synergies that are really important for the ocean climate community and ocean climate action more broadly.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for very comprehensively covering the set of questions that I kind of threw at you. So thank you very much for that. Sri, if I return to you, where do you think science has come in? And where, having heard the other speakers, heard Dr. Manoni as well, on the perspective, I think very important perspective of the Pacific Island Forum members, where can science come in, and where do you think science can do better? Before I, of course, want to turn to Dr. Manoni for his views on, having heard that, we talk about, he mentioned the thing about climate finance, and we talked about the areas where more data is missing. I'll be very interested to hear from Dr. Manoni later. What is the particular aspects that perhaps the members in the forum find challenging, where there's not enough climate finance or not enough capacity to be able to address those questions, which are such important inputs into the GST process. That's really where we want to come down to. So, Dr. Srivatsan, Sri, if I may turn over to you first. And
Yeah,
you know
sure,
so much
thanks.
about ASEAN, so do feel free to share as well.
Sure. So
Practices
coming
from
as a
ASEAN.
climate scientist, I want to stress this, that there needs to be better dialogue with the policymakers and the climate scientists, which I feel is not happening at the pace, the intensity that we want it to. So when I speak to policymakers elsewhere, not just here, the general question is there's a lot of disbelief in what the climate scientists say. And that seems to be a limitation for the policymakers to take it forward. And they say there's uncertainties. I mean, the climate scientists call this climate uncertainty, modeling uncertainties, climate projections uncertainties, and impacts, everything is uncertainty. So given this uncertainty, then the question is, oh, if the climate science is so uncertain, how do you want us to do the implementation? Because everything is uncertain. So how do I move? And I've been telling them, I want to stress this. There is no doubt on the sign of climate change. The doubt and uncertainty lies only in the magnitude of what's going to happen. We still have a bandwidth of, let's say, 1 to 4 degree rise, something, or rainfall is even a nasty parameter in terms of giving a limit, which science cannot do anything about. But there is much more confidence. There's a lot of science which clearly says that we are heading in a particular direction. We do not know just by how much. Is it going to be 2.5, 2.8, or 2.75? That's something science cannot answer, but we have a way forward, which science is showing us. We need to hang on to it strongly and say, okay, let me do this because the science is telling me this. When it comes to implementation on the science, I also see there's a confusion in terms of which comes first. Is it adaptation or is it mitigation? Because on the short-term plan, it seems like I want to, based on all my climate science, climate data, is to go for adaptation. But the wise thing is to take mitigation alongside, do the adaptation for the short term, but not forget that mitigation is a long-term goal. And that's where the climate governance comes, that anybody changes. It should be like a 100-year written law, that any governance comes, anyone comes, you follow this. There's no going back on this. So climate mitigation starts now, and climate adaptation is for the short-term goal of like, okay, how I want to just satisfy the simple things and taking it. But when it comes to ocean, because you're discussing ocean, I wanted to share my view, is we have very poor data from ocean, as much as we have on the land. We have plenty of data resources for many parameters in terms of climate change. I mean, we want to prove to the people that this is happening, right? So in that sense, we don't have that much of climate data coming from the ocean. As we understand, it's not easy. So we have satellite measurements to show us what's happening, the sea surface temperature, sea salinity. We have ocean buoys around Singapore. Of course, we have data. But if you imagine the open, vast ocean in the Pacific or the South China Sea, for example, don't need to go to Pacific. Let's not worry about it. That's the ocean nearby. The land masses where we can do something. We don't have data. So when we want to address, I mean, the way that we have come to know so much over time is also because of our knowledge from observations. The climate observations have showed us so much. And then we use them to project from the climate models to telling what's going to happen. So the first thing we also have to do is to intensify data coverage from the oceans in what best possible way. Probably the ships can do more. We tell them when we are discussing with agencies, we have a lot of navigation. So let's strengthen the network, the ocean network, the best possible. Anybody can contribute to that. Any ships or anybody doing this trade can contribute to this climate effort. And then collectively, once again, the data is a problem. So when you cross a territory, then they say, oh yeah, this is, my ocean, my data or something. I mean, that shouldn't be that my thing, rather than saying, okay, this is just a general data portal that we need to do. So the short answer to this is, how can we protect the ocean? Comes from, well, maybe I'm biased because I'm an atmospheric scientist, is we protect the atmosphere, then the ocean is protected as well. So I know this blue carbon is picking up here, and as well as the coastal ecosystems, which are really showing potential in terms of carbon sequestering, all this. But we need to realize that that falls a small percentage of the entire global landmass. I mean, if somebody asks me, I mean, I have been asked this question, like, okay, you're saying about the coastal ecosystem, because in Singapore, we talk a lot about the blue carbon or the mangroves, the ecosystem, and so forth. Somebody asked me, what would you do if you were in Africa or Europe or bigger landmass? So there's so many landlocked countries where they don't go for any ecosystem thing. So then what is it? So an MIT study a few years suggested that we need the size of Brazil's Amazon rainforest in order to bring down the carbon dioxide. I mean, they said this, they just made a map and say, okay, we need this kind of an extent of forests and greenery that we really want to sequester the carbon dioxide, which seems impractical on a big scale, but then pockets of such everywhere, along with this blue carbon effects, I think we will get somewhere. But of course, I think the small island developing states may have a larger role or maybe the potential to do this, but that would more help them, I guess, in sort of like protecting themselves first, which is important, and then contribute as a goal for a global protection. I mean, that's my view.
Thank you very much. I think that's very illuminating to view it from those lenses that may not always be very obvious to lawyers or to practitioners or to policymakers. Dr. Manoni, may I now turn to you? Having heard all that, would you like to come in, in flagging certain areas of needs where perhaps the scientists could come in, where there's a need, where at least for the members of the forum, those are gaps which would be very helpful in putting into the GST process, and really from your view, how can inputs from the Ocean Dialogue contribute to the efforts in relation to GST and the NDCs? I think that'll be a nice way to round it off from the perspective of the state parties, so to speak. Over to you, Dr. Madan.
Thank you. Well, very generally, some of the challenges that from the point of view of the region in terms of this whole thing is well, if I can start off to say that the challenges with accessing climate change finance. On the one hand, we are at the forefront of all of these, and then on the other, the conditions to access these funds are made difficult. So it does cause us a lot of issues, a lot of challenges in our combined regional efforts, and also at the national level to do that. But in the oceans specific, some of what we as a region have tried to do, for instance, quantify the cost of illegal fishing per year. And some discussion around how our ecosystem, our exclusive economic zones, we be able to quantify what we have and to look at the potential losses that would likely occur as a result of climate change. There are studies now that say with the oceans warming, the migration of the tuna species is going to move eastward away from the region, and what that would mean for us. I mean, the science is very important to support us in this exercise to make sure that we know exactly what the dangers are, what the risks are, and how we can take steps in the future to address those. I mean, we've discussed, we've had conferences this year, debt conferences to look at innovative financing, to look at bonds, and to look at that type of those type of mechanisms to explore those, because we do not know what's going to happen in the future. I mean, science is a good way to inform us, and also innovation around, how we can leverage off what we have in our oceans to prepare for the future. I mean, it is I won't say bleak outlook, but it's quite concerning, and it's really is a big worry on the mind of our Pacific Island Forum leaders every year. Fisheries, for instance, is a standing agenda item on the leaders' agenda every year, because that is, for many of us, the only the revenues that we generate for annual budget for development, economic development, nation building. So all of this could be well supported. The science as a integral part in that. Then to get some assistance, to get some support in what we need to do in terms of the impacts of climate on our oceans, our resources, and the future of our small Pacific islands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moni, for sharing that. I realize we're coming close to the end of our time, and so before I end, I wanted to give every speaker an opportunity to have a final say in a single sentence that you want to leave us with, and then I'll invite Dr. Nilofer, if you don't mind, to be the last speaker and to to give us the closing. But before we do that, I just wanted to share one or two of the questions, and if you feel you want to address that in your final comments, please do so. And I think one of them was really a question of whether one speaker asked whether or not there's a concern of conflict between UNCLOS and UNFCCC, and we kind of addressed that in our earlier intervention. Another comment was really whether in climate change, are the providers of scientific evidence and data not tempted to influence the findings in advance of their argument? So that's perhaps something for Dr. Sri. And then the last question really was on the role and the capacity in relation to the initiatives supporting the inclusion of the community through traditional, customary, and indigenous knowledge, and how participatory in it, and will they have a role and help in planning and implementing mitigation, adaptation, and cross-cutting issues, and of course bring it back into the GST process. So these were some of the questions that were raised in the final session, final few minutes, I would say, of this very interesting discussion. So may I invite Dr. Manoni, if you do have one more, any final words in one second, please invite do that, and then Lisa, Joanna, Petra, Sri, and then Dr. Nilofer, if you don't mind. Dr. Manoni.
Thank you, and thank you for giving me the floor again. But first of all, just to say what a privilege it is to share the stage with our expert panel this afternoon. And like you have alluded to before, it has been a very, very fruitful exchange today. And I myself have also learned quite a bit tonight. But yeah, just on the question about the different legal frameworks under the Law of the Sea Convention and the UNF Framework Climate Change Convention. Under the Law of the Sea Convention, there are also, you have the UN Feedstocks Agreement, you have other subsidiary sort of filling in the gaps, perhaps because the convention did not quite cover all of that. But as we learned in the current ongoing BVNJ negotiations, I think it is a fair question to raise about frameworks not undermining existing frameworks. But like one of our speakers said before, there are things that the Law of the Sea Convention can address in terms of the oceans. There are some issues perhaps that are left to the UNFCCC framework. But I thought, maybe there would be an opportunity again in the future to come back to these discussions and to have these discussions again as we look forward to how we can integrate the oceans more in the discussions around climate change. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Manoni. Lisa?
Thank you. I think my closing remarks would be, or call, I guess, would be to say to get involved to inform the outcomes of the global stocktake outcomes, and pick one of those areas within or adjacent to the UNFCCC that are hiding in plain sight and help make it less hidden.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Joanna?
Thank you. I will refer back on the question around the UN. I refer back to one of the messages coming out of the dialogue in the summer, which is the need for a framework for collaborative efforts across the UN processes, which would increase institutional support for ocean climate action. I think this is really important. The UN works across UN oceans, but it's a DOLAS mandated group. The power for any change in that conversation comes from DOLAS or from the UN General Assembly. Having said that, the UNFCCC, as Dr. Manoni rightly says, is a party-driven process. That means parties are responsible for their own countries and the economic zones or coastal economic zones that they control. And 90% of that includes fisheries, that includes ports, it includes infrastructure that lies along coastlines, that all needs protection. It needs a recognition under planning for long-term development. We need, of course, adaptation and urgent mitigation for to keep 1.5 alive. And I suppose a phrase that we've used a lot in the last few years is that ocean action is climate action. And I think something that we took to UNOC this year that I would really stress moving towards COP27 is the need to blue the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for that. Petra, over to you.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and thank you so much for your expertly sharing of this session. It was very enjoyable. I will be very, very brief and just come back to what Dr. Manoni said. And I think this is not just a one-off workshop. We will have the second workshop, but also a series of 2 conferences, which we will prepare now in the light of all the questions that were discussed and the issues. And I think this is a wonderful baseline, so to speak, to construe an even better concept note for the conferences next year. And we will be in touch again soon. And hopefully we can also work on a submission to the Global Stocktake, as was suggested earlier as well. Thank you again very much.
Thank you, Petra. Sri, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think I agree with everyone. That's the this because it gives the perspectives from different pointers. So yes, I'm in synchrony with the views. Yeah.
Thank you, Sri. Dr. Nilfa, final, over to you to close us off with your last words of wisdom.
Well, thank you so much. It's hard to have the last words after such, great presentations and statements made by our speakers. But I know I started off with somewhat of a provocative question, but in summary, I think that on the positive side, I think we've had very good detailed information on progress that is being made to bring the ocean, and then I think everyone will come away with Joanna's, the ocean that is hidden in plain sight, more into, more visible. And I think that the Global Stocktake is an opportunity to test that. And I really appreciated Lisa's explanation of a rather complex looking process, but also explaining how the ocean can be integrated. Very first Global Stocktake. And then absolutely, Dr. Manoni, you said it so well. It's not enough though. We need to see the ocean beyond just a dialogue. I fully agree. It has to be on the agenda. There has to be more focus on specifically on ocean issues that would be appropriate within the UNFCCC framework. I don't think we have to worry about rocking the boat with other regimes, really. And lastly, the importance of science. I think we all agree that we need to have much more engagement with science. It is important. That is what is going to inform our future actions. So I will just end there and thank you, Danielle, for a wonderful moderation, and all the speakers and all the participants who stayed with us for what was, I think, 2 hours, over 2 hours.
Actually.
But I feel we could go on. So I definitely want
have to call time. Well, thank you very much, Nilufer, for that closing, and again, adding my thanks and making a plug as well for part 2 of this series. We've enjoyed part 1. Please sign in for part 2, which will take place this Friday in Petra's capable hands this Friday. Then we've added the link to the site. So thank you, good day, good night, and everybody. Thank you.